The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
It is Monday, August 26th, 2019. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. It is one of our famous, we're on vacation, but we're still doing free content, and it's completely new shows. Not to mention, for our members, we have a deep archive pick from our very own Brendan. Let him loose in the deep archives, skateboarding all around, grabbing the huge reel-to-reel recordings we had. Oh, you're going to love it. Folks, I don't know if you noticed, but we had a little bit of a theme this week. A little bit. We're not dedicating the whole week to a theme. But on Thursday, we did something, it came from Something Awful, a book about the memes on 4chan, 8chan. And today, Professor, University of Michigan in the Departments of American Culture, History, Alexandra Minna Stern, on her book, Proud Boys and the White Ethno-State. Particularly relevant in light of, I don't know, what was it, last week, a week and a half ago, big clashes in Portland, the Proud Boys, and also in my rejection of Gavin McInnes's offer to be on his show. I want to make something clear about that. We never did a video on that. Maybe we should do this actually. Maybe we did one earlier this week, because I'm recording this a week ago from when you're hearing it. And maybe the day after a week ago, we decided to do this. But apparently Gavin, put out a video saying that, complaining that I had rejected him. Let me make it clear. Not only would I go on Gavin McInnes's show for $250,000, he offered me $5,000. That was simply not enough. I need $250,000 before I go on a show that Gavin is just, the moderator. But make no mistake about this. I will debate Gavin on any platform for free. I just am not going to put him in a position where he gets to be a third party, where he gets to have a variety show.
It's to play Chuck Todd.
Yeah, that's not happening. It will. I should be fair. To be fair, it can happen, but I got to get $250,000 for it. But if Gavin wants to have a debate with me, I'm happy to do that. I am willing to debate any conservative. But when you come at me and offer me $5,000 for your Reformation project, no, that's $250,000. That's my minimum for that. And then if you want me there with my contact lenses instead of my glasses, that's $350,000. $350,000. I want to make that clear. Meanwhile, we're on vacation right now, and I'm at the beach. I hope I'm relaxed. I probably am not. If you're not listening to the AM Quickie, you're making a huge mistake, because I'm doing it. I'm doing it on vacation. Of course, half the time Lucy Steiner is doing it, but the other half I'm doing it. All you need to do is subscribe to the Majority Report podcast feed, the free version, and it will be there in that feed, and it'll show up every morning, hopefully by 9 at the latest. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to push it onto its own feed. But that's it. Enjoy today's show. Alexandra Minna Stern. She is a professor at University of Michigan on her book, Proud Boys and the White Ethno-State. We'll be right back. What does it take for you to believe? We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Alex Minna Stern. She is a professor of history and American culture at the University of Michigan. Her latest book is Proud Boys and the White Ethnostate, How the Alt-Right is Warping the American Imagination. Alex, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
So your previous book was entitled Eugenic Nation, and I'm curious as to how, because I think this might be the first academic treatment, or at least the one I am aware of this sort of generation, I guess, of these folks, and specifically the Proud Boys. But how did you come to write this book?
Well, I've long been interested in nationalist movements and ultra-right movements in the U.S. and beyond. So there's just kind of I'm generally taking stock of what's happening. And as someone who is socially and politically aware, I was very much aware of what was happening in the U.S. around 2015, 2016 as this coalescing movement that later came to be called the alt-right and has these many different facets to it that we can talk about, how that was coming together. And so I began to delve into some of their websites and some of their key ideas, some of their publications. And one of the things that struck me right away was the extent to which they are rehabilitating eugenic ideas from the early 20th century, really foregrounding the kind of eugenic racism that someone like Madison Grant believed in. He's a real hero still to white nationalists, and ideas about immigration, the body politique, who should be breeding, who shouldn't be breeding, and ideas about preservation of the white race, which is really what kind of ideologically links, the earlier eugenics to the white nationalism of today. So that prompted my interest in following a range of different threads, and, in academic speak, we'd say these genealogies of white nationalism across time, from earlier in the 20th century, but really making this book more a history of the present that focuses on, well, what has happened in the past, 10 plus years that has allowed these ideas to cohere and to manifest themselves in social media, and I would argue to creep into the mainstream in ways that are dangerous and sometimes quite insidious, and obviously sometimes quite obvious and horrifying and deadly. So there's a bunch of different registers there.
I may be jumping ahead here, but you mentioned the sort of the genealogy of it, and I also want to ask you the taxonomy. But before we get to that, I mean, when we see something like this, do you, from an academic perspective, are we looking at a new phenomena, or are we looking at a diminished phenomena? Like, does that make sense? Like is this? Are we looking at a sort of a degraded version of stuff from the past, or is it a new phenomena that is growing using the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is. We can certainly say to a good extent this is kind of old wine in new bottles, and some of those new bottles are social media platforms and different types of networking and things like that. So some of the ideas that are kind of bedrock to white nationalism, which have been bedrock to earlier nationalist movements or neo-fascist movements, are ideas about, the great return to, a magnificent earlier time, the kind of nostalgia, the focus on rigid gender relations and patriarchy, racism and xenophobia, the idea of creating others. And so those kind of aspects, yes, those have been repackaged. To those who are aware of the history, they might seem quite obvious. However, I think there are a few things going on that make this particular moment distinctive, and distinctive and also make it so we really need to be aware of the way in which white nationalism is playing out. And just to name two of those, one is the fact that in the United States, the demographic composition of the country is changing. And so, we are moving into becoming an ethno-racial plurality of a nation. I think about 5 states have already kind of crossed that bar thus far. And for us, that might well be is something to celebrate and something to really kind of that expresses the promise and the greatness of America as an inclusive and democratic nation. But for white nationalists, what that means is their inevitable extinction. And so you have this kind of, the way they see it, the demographic, drum is beating, and it's accelerating towards 2050. And, that incites a lot of panic and a lot of concern among them that they will become not only a minority, but a persecuted minority. So this demographic narrative, which, by the way, the El Paso shooter linked that narrative to concerns about climate change and calls himself an eco-fascist. So that's they're kind of pulling that into it. So one key issue is, the demographic issues, and really, those of us on kind of liberals and on the left, we need to have more ownership and framing of those demographic narratives in a positive way. Because even some of the reporting I see in the New York Times, edges into kind of defensive terrain on that. And one of the second points is that, this is really transnational. So while these ideas might have skipped around from country to country, let's say, neo-Nazi ideas or fascist ideas, or if you think about the America First ideas back in the 30s that resonated with what was going on in other parts of Europe and even Latin America, what we have today is, this is white nationalists in the U.S. Their ideas are transnational, and often those who are the most active, their networks are transnational. So they are connected to either through active networking or through kind of trafficking of ideas with organizations, and in many cases political parties in countries such as Germany with Alternative for Germany, Sweden with the Sweden Democrats, and a whole range of other of international groups. So there's an internationalization that is part of this at a time when, of course, as we're seeing the rise of authoritarianism and national populism in countries as diverse as, India, Brazil, and Italy.
Right.
So I think there's more that makes it distinctive, and I'm not saying everything here is new, because it's not, and it's tapping into longer histories of white supremacy in the U.S., but there are elements of it that require us to kind of, what I would say is like fine-tune our antennae to the moment so we can better understand it and we can better counteract it.
Okay, and I want to return to both those two unique elements of this, iteration, I guess, in a moment. But let's return to the genealogy and the taxonomy. The difference between the new and old white nationalism, or the present day white nationalism versus sort of the old one. But also, can you help us with the various versions of nationalism, and which ones should we be more alarmed at? Or are they, when we hear civic nationalism, when we hear ethno-nationalism, these are all terms that are sort of bandied about, and I can't tell if these are sort of, they're I'm just a little bit more polite. I go to slightly different functions, and so I call it civic nationalism as opposed to ethno-nationalism or versus white nationalism. Or is it more like I'm doing funnel sales? I have a sales funnel, and if I can sell you on civic nationalism, I'm that much closer to selling you on ethno-nationalism and then white nationalism.
Yeah, I think that those distinctions themselves are very important to those in the alt-right, alt-light kind of white nationalist circles. for a few reasons. The first is that, the kind of conventional understanding has been that those who are part of the alt-right are civic nationalists who are interested in slamming multiculturalism, slamming feminism, and will bring out dog whistles of anti-Semitism or, other ideas of racism, but they're not willing to take the plunge and to, kind of proclaim themselves to be white nationalists who believe that there needs to be a white ethno-state or to make full-throated kind of racist comments. However, I think you're right that the lines between those, they kind of often will play a dance back and forth between those two terms to kind of rub them up against one another to make their identities clear or less clear. So, for example, you'll find some of the white nationalists that I follow on Twitter, like to often make proclamations, I'm not a white nationalist, and then they'll slam someone like Stephen Molyneux or Lauren Southern, who they categorize as a civic nationalist. Now, many of those looking in from kind of like the broad panorama, Stephen Molyneux or Lauren Southern look very much like white nationalists, or they have very similar ideas because they're talking about racial essentialism, they're talking about patriarchal notions of gender, they're talking about the need to, kind of stamp out diversity and multiculturalism and what a threat it is, and basically how white people are under attack. I would say that, in the literature, kind of some of the political science and sociology literature, civic nationalism has not been talked about in that way. It's been talked about as kind of a way to compare nations that are bound by compacts and constitutions and ideas of liberal citizenship and subjecthood, which is what ideally the United States is and what many countries are that have these binding documents that we know are updated with amendments like, thank God for the 14th Amendment and, other precedent, case law and things like that. So in that literature, there's a real distinction between civic nationalism, which is based on principles and ideas and the kind of the beacon of light, even if we're not quite getting there, but at least the goal to get towards equality for all, whereas ethno-nationalism would be seen as the opposite of that. So what I see going on is that, white nationalists are really interested in troubling that line between civic and ethno-nationalism and basically blurring the line to such an extent that ethno-nationalism creeps in both into the discourse, ideally into the policies, but becomes more of just kind of a way of life and a way of thinking in the United States. And that's happening in other countries where there are identitarian movements and, other kind of actors and organizations like that. So I hope that makes sense. I mean, I would say that, I would call white nationalists ethno-nationalists, far-right nationalists. I mean, you can use different terms. I think I would want to keep civic nationalism as something that we might want to hold on to, and not, cede to their own discursive games.
Well, I mean, I guess the civic nationalist is what? Is saying that we must, America for Americans and having the broadest perspective on what Americans are. I mean, is that what civic nationalism is when it is unmolested or sort of like tainted by white nationalism, or not? I mean, what does that mean? If we're going to hang on to it, what does it mean? I mean, because I can't help but think that, like, take a guy like Dave Rubin, who in a different context is trying to define himself, or did for a while, as a liberal, as the last liberal, and sort of like dragging that term into his area, right? As opposed to sort of him going to that term or conflating it and confusing it, and then arguing that people have abandoned him, right? The sort of using that, like, I didn't leave this party, the party left me, but first he's becoming the party. I mean, so is the agenda, and so much, obviously your book is so much about how language is used to sort of move the terrain under us, right? It starts where we're describing the terrain, but then all of a sudden it transports us in some way. Is the agenda to sort of assume civic nationalism, whatever that is supposed to mean, and then to the point where it's like, before you know it, if you are for multiculturalism, you're actually not even like a good citizen. You're not even like patriotic anymore, because the definitions have been sort of like the ground, the rhetoric has moved us on a different part of terrain, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've captured it well. I mean, I think that that's also one of the challenges of writing a book in real time, is that, the terrain is shifting, the lines are being realigned kind of as we speak, and it's an interesting case with Rubin because, here you have it where ethno-nationalism is pushing up so much. It's pushing and expanding and, kind of creeping to such an extent that, defining civic nationalism has become a point of contestation. So I think, let's say, here's a thought exercise. So let's say, some of the, Democratic contenders decided that they wanted to take that term and to really seize upon it and to, fill in the colors on it, to think about kind of what a democratic, inclusive America in this particular moment would look like. They could do something like that, and that might be quite beneficial because if not, the ground potentially could be ceded. So I don't actually know, rather than give an exact answer, X equals this or Y equals that, I think what we need to do is we need to be attuned to the ways in which these words are being misused, distorted, and how those distortions themselves are reflections of the really kind of tricky and treacherous political times in which we're living. I hope that makes sense.
I think it does, but
helps answer the question.
Yes, well, it's that these terms are up for. I mean, it's the sort of the classic if being a liberal means everyone has health care, then I'm a liberal, essentially, right? I mean, it is trying to shift people with you and sort of, I guess, increase the circle of trust or circle of, whatever they call that media term, I guess, and sort of say like, oh, maybe I'm a blank and I didn't realize it. And they don't necessarily, because in some ways, I guess it's playing on the inherent tribalism that people feel in general in the way that they identify themselves. I mean, is that these language games that are being played? What is the end game, I guess, or is that the end game? And then what are the subsidiary games that lead there? Like, what is the difference between sort of the strategic thinking? Like, I personally, after having observed Dave Rubin for an extended period of time, I don't know that he has an ideological strategy as much as maybe at best a career strategy, and then just uses a series of tactics up to that point. But, and in many respects, I think he may be, sort of as much of a, I don't want to say victim, but a subject of these games as he is a purveyor of them. But what is the end game?
The end game for kind of the white nationalists themselves?
Yes.
What do they want to... Well, I would say that, the end game, if you look at core beliefs of white nationalists, is to create a white ethno-state, a return to a white supermajority. And the way to do that, I mean, it's interesting because, back in 2008, 2010, when a lot of these kind of alt-right or white nationalist websites were getting up and running and were putting forth their ideas, they were bandying about this term metapolitics, which you can still find. And, even Richard Spencer, when he was interviewed at one point, what is the alt-right about? He said, the alt-right is about metapolitics. And most people, probably their eyes glazed over and said, what the heck is that? And what he meant by that was that the way to actually, kind of bring about the kind of change that he and other white nationalists want is to change culture. Basically the idea that politics is downstream from culture, that kind of famous phrase. And how do you do that? You do that through, some of these language games we've talked about. You do that through, as one scholar said, taking over the book clubs, infiltrating popular culture. That would obviously involve social media, even the whole podcast, growing podcast world, which has taken off in the past 5 or 10 years. So all of those would be spaces where meta-political awakening in their terms could be achieved. Now, that's why white nationalists were really kind of caught off guard when Trump actually won the election, because they were just kind of moving forward with their meta-political work. And then, lo and behold, a bunch of, this kind of perfect strange storm of events happened in, 2016, and thanks to the Electoral College, Trump became president. And so that kind of threw the whole alt-right and white nationalists for a loop, because now they were in a situation where, they were moving ahead on what they would call their metapolitical terrain, which, by the way, is all influenced by ideas from the Italian thinker Gramsci and his idea of kind of needing to have a war of position and all of that. But in any case, and then all of a sudden they've got this stuff they've been doing, let's say, more in the down low, and then, have elected someone who they think is going to be able to move forth and build the wall and ban immigrants and, institute a much more authoritarian style America. Now, it's been a lot more problematic and contested and distorted than that. And many white nationalists, today feel like, Trump has totally wimped out, even though many, on the liberal and left side, basically just see Trump as a white nationalist himself, even though white nationalists, most of them don't like him. They think that he has failed them. You can look at tweet after tweet by Ann Coulter, for example, complaining about, Trump and all the things that he hasn't done and how he's let them all down.
Interesting. And so let's talk a little bit more about the alt-right and where they situate themselves. I mean, you write about Jordan Peterson as well, and I'm interested in this confluence of how white nationalism and how the interplay between things like anti-feminism, anti-trans, all of these things seem to roll together and ultimately lead to race, or they part and parcel. I mean, I have this concept that, to a certain extent, we as, non-white nationalists or non-racist, to the extent that, anyone is free of racism, I guess, perceive these anti-feminism or misogyny or anti-trans or anti-gay or whatever it is as sort of distinct silos, as opposed to from the perspective of a racist, where it's just like, oh, I just don't like people who aren't like me. And, like my in-group. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah. I think, if I were to write a second book, which I don't know if I have the emotional energy to do, I really would focus just on the so-called alt-right, or those that are kind of at what I would say the kind of like the pushing edge of kind of bringing some of these insidious ideas, kind of anti-feminist, multicultural ideas kind of more into the mainstream. So it was really striking for me, as I was writing this book, that's when Jordan Peterson was getting all of this play. And he's a very interesting character who may have helped some young men get their life together. He has spoken out against authoritarianism. In some instances, people may just feel like that's lip service or whatever. But what I was interested in about him was I'm not saying like Jordan Peterson is a white nationalist. No, he's spoken out against that. But Jordan Peterson is a transphobe, a very self-proclaimed transphobe who has, that is one of kind of the key pieces of his agenda. And he also has really strong ideas about gender essentialism and racial essentialism when it comes to things like intelligence and capacity to do certain types of work and things like that. So that's why I became interested in in Peterson, because it's interesting how those ideas, the palatable way in which he was presenting those ideas, brought a lot of people into social media and ended up, as they say from studies that have been done, red pilling them, and then from that they would follow, go down a variety of rabbit holes which might lead them to the American Renaissance website, which is the website run by the Race Realist Organization and Jared Taylor. So I think the alt-right is they're doing that work of kind of pushing the boundaries of moving this kind of thought into, kind of the mainstream, or maybe also what they're doing is they're kind of reflecting and amplifying ideas that are already in the mainstream and, creating these channels back and forth between what we would call kind of more exclusionary or regressive ideas and ideas that are just kind of are kind of ho-hum to some folks as well. So I think I don't know, the alt-right, should we really call it the alt-right? And I've thought a lot about that. I think if I were to, write a, kind of a book or a long essay about that, I would come up with a different term, which I haven't quite figured out yet, sorry, to talk about them in terms of being, a leading edge. The one thing that I will add to that is a lot has been written on the alt-right or the rise of white nationalism, and there's some really good books out there. Many of them have been written by journalists where they followed particular individuals or they looked at organizations. They're really good at storytelling. And a lot of them focus primarily on racism and xenophobia. And all of that is really important and all of that is really interesting. But what I wanted to do with this book was to actually tell a history of the ideas of the alt-right in the present, and to kind of unearth those genealogies, and also to foreground the extent to which misogyny and sexism are glue that kind of are the glue that is essential, to this movement. Now, again, that's not completely new, traditionalism, patriarchy, all of that. But what it looks like in circa 2019 is somewhat new. And that's why transphobia is absolutely bedrock to what both the alt-right and the alt-right are about, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to unpack it. So I think there's a bunch of connecting dots. Not everyone who, is exposed to this will connect all those dots, nor will they be interested in doing so, nor will they, follow the social media trends that will allow them to do so. But, they are connected and they can help perpetuate, kind of the more insidious and exclusionary and, even potentially violent aspects of the alt-right.
So if I understand you, the what we're calling, for lack of a better term, the alt-right is in some ways sort of like creating the tools or the functions that can lead you to these conclusions, but they're not necessarily adopting themselves. They're just getting you to adopt the legitimacy of the tools that lead you there in some way. Create this idea of pseudoscience, or this notion about how you can break down structures in society because of a of a lack of traditionalism or whatnot, and that inevitably leads you down a certain path in some way. But they're not necessarily doing that consciously, I guess. It's just one that they find effective because they'll get support from specific areas. I want to get back to the sort of the 2 points that you were saying was that why do you think there is this, what is driving the fear of extinction? I mean, obviously this notion of I think you called it diverse plurality but what is it, are they just jumping from the notion of not being centered in society is extinction, or is the extinction really just a mechanism is that just a rhetorical game?
Yeah, I mean, first I just want to go back quickly to your last point and say I think a good way to phrase it is that, the alt-right is priming the pump for these kinds of ideas, but this priming the pump, and is basically, kind of pushing that open. Now, in terms of, this kind of fears of demographic anxieties and fears of white extinction, white nationalists, put forth the idea that diversity and multiculturalism, and kind of behind that curtain is, sits Jews and feminists, so there's anti-feminism and anti-Semitism there as well, that all of that is leading to white genocide. And this is being, so many of them believe that, this is a plot being orchestrated by Jewish cabals and so on and so forth. Again, that's not something that's that new, but what it's tied to is the fact that the demographic composition of the United States is changing. According to census projections, we will become an ethno-racial plurality. And I use that term explicitly because, the term that you will often hear is that we'll become a majority-minority nation. And that means that, we'll become a nation that's a majority of minority groups, and whites will no longer be the majority. I mean, that's the thinking. However, political scientists have found that if you use that formulation,
right,
which is really kind of like a black-white formulation, you prime, whites to be more anxious about demographic change. So, yeah, I mean, demographic change is a big one.
It also seems unjust. How can you let the minority be the majority? I mean, it's sort of like it seems illogical on some level. I mean, I guess that frame.
It does. It's a really weird construct. So that's why I say ethno-racial plurality. And basically, the thing is that behind that is an idea of white purity. So whites will be bred out of existence because whites must be, and this is where ancestry testing and the rest of it comes in, at least, whatever, 80-90%, Scottish or Irish or German or, Nordic in some way, shape, or another. It very much is, a reflection of the, deep-seatedness of kind of the one-drop rule of racial thinking in the United States. So, for example, white nationalists, when they use those numbers about, heading towards the 2050 census, we're talking about non-Hispanic whites only. So Latinos don't count as white. South Asians don't count as white. No one else counts as white except for these formulations that were the ones that were so in vogue in the eugenics era of the 1920s, when Madison Grant and others were writing these, talking about taxonomies, producing these taxonomies, that basically put all of the, kind of, good and solid and robust whites in one category. At that point, they were, focusing on excluding kind of the new immigrants or the bad whites, in other words, the Italians and the Poles and so on. Now everything's become much more amalgamated, and whiteness, because it changes over time, has kind of expanded to include those groups. But yeah, I would say that if you look at the construct, it's one that's about the fear of loss of kind of the predominance of kind of white superiority, white purity, and, there really is this fear that, that whites as a tribe, so to speak, will be, decimated and outbred to the point of actual disappearance. And so, by, let's say, 2100 or, 100 years from now, if immigration rates and, fertility rates and so on and so forth continue apace. And, when white nationalists in the U.S., kind of clang the bell about the demographic crisis, they are very much in tune with their fellow travelers in Europe who are raising similar concerns about what's happening in France or, Sweden or, a range of other countries.
I was going to ask you that, like what accounts for that transnationalism? Like, why is it transnational now?
Well, in a way, there's always been a transnational aspect to any kind of, these intellectual movement and cross-fertilization of ideas. But I would say that, that's one instance where social media has really played a role in terms of allowing actors and organizations to be in touch with each other, both in visible, microblogging spaces like Twitter, but also kind of like, behind the scenes and, using platforms like Discord or having secret Facebook groups or whatever. So basically, these groups are in regular contact with one another, and every time they see that something has happened, like, let's say that, there was an article about the Sweden Democrats, and I can't remember the exact number, but because of parliamentary systems in Europe, like in many countries, far right groups have 15 to 30% of the seats in Parliament on the national level, and that's actually happened in the European Union Parliament as well, where they've decided to say, okay, we're not going to just reject the European Union. We don't like it. We're going to destroy it from within. So we're going to try to be elected to it. But in any case, the point is that, U.S. white nationalists feel kind of white-pilled is the term that they like to use when they see the gains that, that their, so-called comrades are making, in other parts of the globe. And there's a lot of traffic back and forth, not only, kind of traffic on the internet, but, there are movements of, some of the key leaders and speakers who will go to these forums and these conferences where sometimes the video content is uploaded to YouTube and sometimes not. And in fact, Jared Taylor, I don't know if you've heard of him, who's a race realist who has been the kind of the long-standing head of American Renaissance. He was actually blocked from going to a conference, I don't know now, about 6 months ago, while he was en route to Poland. I think he was stopped in somewhere in Switzerland, and he wrote kind of a cry de coeur, manifesto about what had happened to him and how he would continue the fight and things like that. But that reverberated across the whole kind of, white nationalist circles. But definitely, yeah, it's both the networking that's going on, and then it's a phenomenon that's happening. I mean, national populism is on the rise around the world for complex reasons related to geopolitics and, big macroeconomic questions and things like that. And, how it's going to play out, it's hard to tell. But, I think we have to be vigilant because, things potentially are heading in a direction that don't look so good.
Yeah, we're recording this on a day where we see, at the very least, Stephen Miller ascendant and the sort of continuing squeezing of immigration in this country. All right. Lastly, let me just ask you this: like obviously Proud Boys, first two words of the title. Do Proud Boys sit in the center of this in terms of like, you mentioned that things like anti-Semitism, feminism, they become like a glue. Are they situated in such a place where they're sort of, I guess they're, there's some type of sinew in this movement?
One of the reason why I used those two terms in the title was I wanted to flag both that misogyny and sexism and the racism and xenophobia are integral parts of the movement. They are interconnected. And it's interesting with the Proud Boys because, I haven't told the story before, but, once the book was up on Amazon with the title, I actually got a letter from the Proud Boys lawyer claiming that they were going to sue me for defamation and misrepresentation. By the way, their lawyer has already been he's been since suspended in Texas for misrepresenting something or whatever. So he's not. I don't think he's even practicing law right now, and I haven't heard from them again. But, what's interesting is they said in the letter, you're portraying us as white supremacists, you're portraying us as racist, you're portraying us as this, that, and the other. And actually in the book, I put them in general in the panorama of the rise of white nationalism, but my focus is on the Proud Boys as a misogynistic organization that really foregrounds kind of transphobia and a certain type of toxic masculinity, which I then link to, kind of the solidification of white nationalism. So the things that they were purporting that I was doing in the book, I'm actually not doing. I'm trying to kind of show a more complex terrain in which these various pieces are interlinked. But I would just underscore again and again, and this is one of the things, where we need to be able to respond, okay, what happened in El Paso, we know that was, a xenophobic white nationalist shooter who was concerned about the, quote, Hispanic invasion, end quote. And he even said it when he was interviewed. Basically, he wanted to kill Mexicans.
Right.
And so then folks are saying, oh, well, no, but he was completely different than the shooter in Dayton who supposedly, likes Elizabeth Warren, or he would like Antifa. Well, then we have to pull back and say, well, what is actually, pull away from thinking about this in Republican or Democratic terms. What is connecting these types of young male white actors? Well, it is a kind of, violent misogyny, a concern with who is going to be part of the body politic, and a stewing in the toxic waters of places like, 8chan and 4chan and Gab and things like that. So I see more in common between those shooters because I'm applying this feminist lens and thinking about it in terms of misogyny. And that's why I foreground the Proud Boys, because it really is essential to kind of use that lens when trying to understand that movement, and to not immediately make everything about xenophobia and racism, as important as those issues are. They need to be coupled with this kind of multifaceted perspective.
I mean, on some level, it's just a function of people who are violently, in some fashion, and I'm using that term loosely, protecting some type of sort of traditional structure. I mean, we're talking about reactionaries, essentially.
Yeah, reactionaries and extremists. And I think that your point and an earlier point you made, which was a really good one, is that one of the other key elements that is this kind of really deep-seated nostalgia and this, fear that what America once was, which it never really was, by the way, but that is being lost, or the way that things were, is going to be eradicated forever. And so there's that real kind of sense of kind of preservation, retrenchment, protection, and things like that, both on the kind of more xenophobic side of things and on the more misogynistic side of things. So I think that nostalgia, there's almost always kind of a ugly underside to nostalgia when it leads to wanting to recreate some, fantasy exclusionary past.
Well, in some respects,
that the shooters,
in some respects,
yeah,
I mean, to be fair, it was an exclusionary past. Right? It
was. It was, but it wasn't. I mean, yes. I mean, and that's why white nationalists look back at the 1960s. 1960 for them is the sweet spot. The U.S. was almost 90% white because of the restrictive immigration laws that have been in place since 1924. And that was the heyday when, Americans were going to the moon, when, when Leave It to Beaver was on TV, in which people were moving to the suburbs, and life was calm and life was good in that kind of Cold War America. So that is kind of their idealized version. Now, historians have shown that things were never quite like that, and we've always been a kind of more diverse and mixed country than that. But indeed, I think you're right. I mean, there's two sides to that coin.
Right, indeed. Well, Alex Minna Stern, the book is Proud Boys and the White Ethno-State, How the Alt-Right is Warping the American Imagination. We will put a link to this at majority.fm. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for all your questions.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bar. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive between the 101 and the 5. Do you know how far the detour takes you? Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. The months drifted into years, while I shifted in and out of gear, waiting for my moment to happen. I don't know how much longer I can stay in, or how much more I got to pay to play in. I know somehow